Liberal democracy begins with a promise that power belongs to the people, that governments exist only through the consent of the governed. John Locke called it consent, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau called it the general will. The idea is simple and powerful, that ordinary citizens, through voting, can shape the direction of a state. But the reality is more complicated. Modern democracies rely on systems designed to translate millions of individual voices into political power. Elections, secret ballots, free press, and independent courts. These institutions are meant to protect accountability, to ensure that leadership reflects the public will. But what happens when the system changes what that will looks like? In Canada's first-past-the-post system, representation is not proportional. It's territorial. Power is not awarded to the most supported party overall, but to the one that wins the most ridings. The result is a paradox at the center of liberal democracy. In 2011, a majority government was formed with just 39.62% of the vote, and in 2019, that number dropped to 33.1%. More than half the electorate did not vote for the governing party, and yet governed. So the question becomes unavoidable. If most people did not choose the government, who exactly is being represented? Electoral systems are only part of the story. Some distortions are structural. Gerrymandering reshapes electoral boundaries in ways that can tilt outcomes before a single vote is cast. It rigs representation to fuel the support or lack thereof for a specific party. Voter apathy removes voices entirely. When participation drops, democracy begins to reflect those who show up, not the population as a whole. And those who show up are not always evenly distributed. Meanwhile, influence does not end at the ballot box. Interest groups and lobbying can amplify the power of organized and well-funded minorities. In theory, liberal democracy treats all citizens as equal. In practice, access and influence are uneven. Some voices are louder, some are heard more often, and some shape policies before the public even sees them. Even elected representatives do not always vote independently. Party discipline, enforced through the party whip, ensures unity within political parties. But it also limits the autonomy of individual representatives. In many cases, MPs vote not only as representatives of their constituents, but as members of a party structure. Step back and a pattern emerges. Liberal democracy is built on the idea of public consent, but that consent is filtered through electoral systems, geography, participation, institutions, and power. What reaches government is not a pure expression of the people's will. It is a shaped version of it, structured and negotiated, refined through systems designed to balance stability with representation. And so, the contradiction remains. Democracy promises the voice of the people, but delivers something more complex. Not a mirror, but a translation, and in that translation, something is always lost. Liberalism is built on a foundation of rights: freedom of speech, freedom of movement, protection under the law, and the idea that the individual stands at the center of political life. But history shows a consistent pattern. In moments of crisis, those principles are tested, and sometimes suspended. During the First and Second World Wars, Canada enacted the War Measures Act, a law designed for national emergencies. But in practice, it granted the state extraordinary power. Civil liberties could be suspended, censorship could be imposed, and individuals could be detained without charge or normal legal process. Entire communities were affected. Ukrainian, German, and Italian Canadians faced restrictions, and more than 22,000 Japanese Canadians were forcibly interned and dispossessed of their property. In the name of security, rights were narrowed. This pattern repeated in 1970 during the October Crisis. the FLQ carried out political violence that triggered a national emergency, and in response, the government again invoked the War Measures Act. Over 450 individuals were arrested. Civil liberties were sharply restricted, and for a brief period, fear reshaped the boundaries of law. In modern era, the tools have changed, but the logic remains familiar. After 9/11, democratic governments expanded anti-terror legislation. The USA Patriot Act increased surveillance powers, including wiretaps and searches. Canada's Anti-Terrorism Act strengthened state authority through preventive arrest provisions and expanded investigative powers. The justification was consistent. Security requires vigilance. At first, these measures appeared to contradict liberal principles. A system built on individual rights, restricting those very rights. But liberalism contains its own internal mechanism for limitation. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms allows for reasonable limits on rights and freedoms, so long as they can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And in 1988, the Emergencies Act replaced the War Measures Act precisely to reinforce this balance. Emergency powers were not removed, they were contained, placed under legal oversight and bound by constitutional constraint. And yet the tension remains unresolved, because every emergency forces the same question back onto liberalism. How much freedom can be restricted before it stops being freedom? At what point does protection become control? And who decides where that line is drawn? In crisis, liberalism does not disappear. It adapts. But adaptation comes at a cost. And that cost is always measured in the same currency: liberty. For centuries, liberalism focused on a central goal: protecting the freedom of the individual. But challenges of the 21st century are different. Climate change crosses borders, terrorism ignores national boundaries, and poverty affects billions of people across vastly different societies. These are problems that no individual can solve alone, and they force a difficult question. Can an ideology built around individual freedom effectively address collective global challenges? Terrorism presents one of liberalism's greatest tests. Liberal societies value freedom of movement, freedom of expression, and protection from government intrusion. Yet terrorist threats often lead governments to expand surveillance, strengthen security measures, and increase state power. The challenge is clear. How can a society remain free while defending itself against those who would use that freedom to cause harm? In some cases, liberal democracies have attempted to promote liberal values beyond their own borders. Military interventions in places such as Afghanistan were often justified as efforts to combat terrorism, defend human rights, and encourage democratic government. Supporters argued that spreading democracy could create stability and freedom. Critics argued that liberalism cannot simply be exported, that democracy imposed from the outside may struggle to take root, and that intervention can create new conflicts rather than resolve existing ones. The result is a difficult reality. Liberalism may offer solutions to oppression, but implementing those solutions is often far more complicated than the ideals themselves. Climate change presents a different challenge, one that strikes at the heart of classical liberal thought. Classical liberals, such as Adam Smith, believe that individuals and business should be free from excessive government interference. Markets, they argued, would naturally produce prosperity and innovation, but climate change exposes the limits of that approach. The atmosphere does not belong to any one individual, and the consequences of pollution do not stop at property lines. And the future generations that will face the damage we are creating cannot vote on decisions being made today. In response, liberalism evolved. Governments began taking a more active role in protecting the environment. Theodore Roosevelt's conservation policies protected approximately 200 million acres of land. Modern liberal governments often support environmental regulations, conservation efforts, and international agreements designed to reduce environmental damage. In doing so, liberalism shifted. Freedom remained important, but so did collective responsibility. The challenge became finding a balance between economic liberty, and environmental sustainability. Perhaps no issue has challenged liberalism more consistently than poverty. Classical liberalism promoted free markets and limited government involvement in the economy. Its supporters believed that competition, innovation, and self-interest would generate prosperity for everyone. In many ways, it did. Liberal economies created unprecedented wealth and economic growth, but not everyone benefited equally. Critiques argued that unrestricted markets could produce extreme inequality. Wealth accumulated at the top, while others faced poor working conditions, low wages, and economic insecurity. The promise of freedom existed, but for many, the opportunity to exercise that freedom remained limited. In response, modern liberalism adapted once again. Influenced by the ideas of the economist John Maynard Keynes, governments began intervening more directly in the economy. Social programs expanded, public health care developed, minimum wage laws were introduced, and progressive taxation funded services designed to reduce inequality. Countries such as Sweden embraced extensive welfare systems, often described as supporting citizens from cradle to grave. The goal was not to eliminate freedom, but to ensure that freedom was meaningful for more people. However, not everyone agreed. Neoconservatives argued that government intervention creates dependency and limits economic growth. They believed lower taxes, deregulation, and free markets would generate prosperity more effectively than government programs. This debate continues today, not over whether freedom matters, but over how freedom is best protected, through government action or government restraint. Terrorism, climate change, and poverty. Each presents a challenge that liberalism was never originally designed to face. Yet rather than disappearing, liberalism has adapted. It has expanded beyond its classical roots, has embraced new responsibilities, and it continues to evolve in response to a changing world. But adaptation comes with its own question. If an ideology must continually change to survive, at what point does it become something new? And can liberalism continue evolving without losing the very principles that define it? Behind every debate about terrorism, climate change, and poverty lies a deeper question. Not about governments, not about economics, not even about liberalism itself, but about responsibility. What do we owe one another? Thousands of years ago, the book of Genesis posed a question that still echoes today. After Cain kills his brother Abel, God asks him where his brother is. Cain responds, "Am I my brother's keeper?" It is one of the oldest moral questions in human history, and in many ways, it remains one of the central questions of political ideology. Classical liberalism leans toward one answer. The individual comes first. People should be free to pursue their own goals, make their own choices, and accept responsibility for the consequences. Government should interfere as little as possible. Freedom, according to classical liberals, allows individuals to reach their full potential. In this view, being your brother's keeper is a personal choice, not a responsibility enforced by the state. Modern liberalism offers a different perspective. It argues that freedom alone is not always enough. A person struggling with poverty, illness, or discrimination may possess legal freedom, but lack the practical ability to exercise it. As a result, modern liberals support programs designed to create greater equality of opportunity via public health care, education, social assistance, and labor protections. The belief is simple. A society functions best when its members do not face hardship alone. Neither perspective rejects freedom. The disagreement lies in how freedom is achieved, through individual responsibility or through collective responsibility, through self-interest or through concern for the common good. The debate over being our brother's keeper is ultimately the debate between competing versions of liberalism itself, and it remains unresolved. Throughout history, liberalism has promised something extraordinary, that individuals possess rights, that governments derive their authority from the people, and that freedom should remain at the center of society. Yet every challenge we have examined reveals a tension within those ideals. Democratic governments seek to reflect the will of the people, yet electoral systems, political parties, and powerful interests can distort representation. Governments claim to protect liberty, yet often restrict freedoms during times of crisis. Liberalism values individual freedom, yet modern global issues frequently require collective action. And while individuals seek independence, societies continue to ask whether we are responsible for one another. These tensions do not prove that liberalism has failed. If anything, they reveal why liberalism has endured. Unlike many ideologies, liberalism is not fixed. It adapts, it debates, and it evolves. Its greatest strength may not be its certainty, but its willingness to question itself. So, to what extent is liberalism viable in contemporary society? The evidence suggests that it remains highly viable, not because it has solved every problem, and not because it has avoided contradiction, but because it continues to provide a framework for balancing freedom, security, equality, and responsibility in a changing world. The struggle is ongoing. The questions remain unanswered. And perhaps that is the true nature of liberalism. Not a destination, but a constant search for balance.